Hey, good morning, folks. Today I'm going to put up a video, little summary of Chapter 5. It's a real turning point in the course because now we're going to talk about contracts, and that's what most of you are here for, other than maybe business organizations. But the heart and soul of business law is contracts. But you need to know some of those jurisdictional legal standards and principles that are the bedrock of how we resolve legal disputes in our society in order to sort of have an application or contextual basis for how we deal with conflict when it comes to alleged breaches of contract and contract enforcement. And so that's why the first four chapters were in the book. But this is a turning point for most of you. Most of you will like it. Just a quick aside on the first quiz that we had for the first module. Some people did well in it, but most did not. Wasn't great results. And so I took a look through the test, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought it was extremely concentrated on pretty challenging jurisdictional questions. And I feeling a little bit bad. I always feel bad when the class doesn't do as well as I had hoped. And I know many of you, all of you, are very bright people. So I don't want people to lose hope. We know we dropped one of the lowest quiz, but the other aspect of it is because it's so tough, I want you to know there's sort of a universal, I wouldn't say universal, but there's a solid core group of people that didn't do well in that test that I know of some of you. I've had you in other classes. So I want you to know that I'm going to put some stuff from chapter 3 and 4 on the next quiz module because I didn't test hardly at all in that, if at all. And I'm not saying I'm making it easier. You want a lot of rigor in the course. You want the course to have significant student learning outcomes for you. But I'm going to be a little bit more copious on the next quiz, and hopefully it'll be a little bit more palpable or understandable as we move forward. So that's just a quick aside. Hey, now chapter 5. I love this chapter, but I'm also a little cautious about it because it's just an introductory concept to contract principles. And I think sometimes when students read it, geez, I understand all that stuff, but what does it really mean? What's the nitty gritty? That's what the rest of the chapters are going to bear out. Chapter 5 just is introducing the vocabulary and the definition of the portions that are required or the elements that are required for a valid contract. The first part I always like to start off with, and I do put a lot of test questions on it when it comes to chapter 5, not a lot, but I think it's important, is every contract is an agreement, but not every agreement is a contract. And I always use the example, well, I'll use the example in a second. So how do you really distinguish it? The contract, the difference in a contract as opposed to just a mere agreement is that in a contract, we expect to be legally bound. We know there might be legal ramifications, whether we breach or the other party or parties. You can have multiple contracting parties in one contract. There's an expectation to be legally bound. Even if it's very simple and very small, you know there are ramifications for non-performance of that contract. That's different than a mere agreement. Like so, and I always use the example, and I'll probably use it on a discussion board question or a test question. I'm often invited to social situations. And although you might think from these videos or those of you that have me in a live class that I'm, outgoing and gregarious and all those things. Actually, I'm very shy and I'm very introverted and I'm a bit of a loner. I like to stay home a lot, if not home, alone anyway, wherever I'm at. And but I have friends, people I've known for a number of years that know me well, and they invite me to things, and I always say yes, and I almost never go. So do those kinds of agreements where I say, yeah, I'll come to dinner next Saturday night. And even if they say, Jim, I'm going to spend some money on this thing, I really expect you to, if you're making a commitment to show up, do so. Otherwise, I'm going to lose money on the food and things like that. And, we set aside time and expense as a result of your promise to come. Would I be legally bound if I don't? And your common sense is probably saying, well, no, it's a social situation. You're out for an evening dinner with friends and you don't show up. And I'm saying I have no excuse. I have no defense. We're going to learn later about potential defenses to enforcement, excuses, if you will. This is not one of them. I just didn't want to go. I changed my mind. I'd rather stay home and hang out with the dog. That is not a valid rationale. But am I legally bound? No, I'm not. And it's a fine line sometimes. What is an agreement where we expect to be bound, which isn't? So that's where the chapter starts. But then it gets into the nitty gritty of what every kind of rubric can be, or every situation can be measured by a rubric of whether or not you have a valid binding contract. And it goes over the elements. It's on page 49 of my book, and it should be your book too if you have the 19th edition. Better have the 19th edition. The first is there must be a mutual meeting of the minds. We have an agreement. Both the offeror, the one making the offer, and the offeree agree to the essential terms of the agreement. Otherwise, you don't have a contract. That's kind of common sense, but you'd be surprised how factual situations arise where the parties seem very close, but do they have a true intent to be bound to the same set of material facts? Because sometimes there's one issue that might be outstanding, and you say, well, geez, now we're bound. No, it has to meet all of the essential elements, have to be identical from offeror to offeree agreeing on those essential terms. If not, you don't have a contract. The next one, both parties need to be competent, and these are the later chapters are going to explore these elements. So that first element I talk about, mutual meeting of the mind, called an offer and acceptance, that's going to be explored in chapter 6. So don't worry if you don't understand all the nuances of what needs to be in the offer, what needs to be in acceptance. We'll get to that in chapter 6. You just need to know that that's the first element. The second element, both parties need to be competent. Well, first is about, let's just talk about mental competence. We presume in law that people are mentally competent to enter into contracts. It's a very low threshold. All they have to at least has the ability to. They don't have to be literate. They don't have to be able to read and write. They don't have to be the smartest person in the world. They just have to have enough wherewithal to understand the obligation we're entering into. And if someone challenges it and says, either my client or myself, I wasn't competent to enter into that contract validly, it's my burden to prove, because the law presumes I am competent, I have to prove I am incompetent. And usually that's done through medical experts coming to testify that I have mental limitation from intelligence, or I have an illness such that at the time I entered the contract, I was suffering from some kind of limitation that didn't allow me to understand the nature of the obligation I was entering into. The other is called capacity. It's very similar. We often think of them interchangeably, capacity and competency. But capacity usually relates to things like age. Now, a lot of people think minors can't enter into a valid contract. Yes, they can. We get to this definitional concept later, that the contract becomes voidable at the election of the party that's lacking capacity. And so a 15-year-old, a 16-year-old, they can go into a store and enter into a valid contract, but the minor usually has the ability to disaffirm the contract and unravel it and basically do away with the obligation. That's going to shock a lot of people. That's chapter 7. So we need competency, we need capacity. One that the book doesn't talk about that I always like to talk about is sometimes an agent doesn't have the power to enter in a contract on behalf of a principal, or there really is no agency or principal. The other is sometimes a person tries to sell a piece of property and turns out really not to be their property at all. It's a relative's property, or the property is technically owned by a corporation and the person trying to act on behalf of the corporation doesn't have the authority to do so. They lack capacity. And I know right now you're saying, what the hell is he just talking way too fast? The other chapters are going to explore these concepts and draw them up. I'm just trying to give you the rough rubric or outline of all valid contracts, what they need. The third element that the book goes over is, and this is a fun one, it needs to be supported by consideration. I promise to paint your house. I'll be out within 2 weeks before the weather turns, or within the month, within 30 days from today. Am I bound? Well, no, because you didn't exchange some kind of legal detriment to me. You didn't say, yeah, and I'll pay you $3,000 for 2 coats of latex finish paint of a certain quality. You don't even have to have that much detail. But there needs to be an exchange. And there's a Latin term for it. You might have heard it before, quid pro quo. Some of you might study sexual harassment, for example. In order to get that job or that promotion, you got to date the boss. That's quid pro quo, something for something. It's illegal in sexual harassment. You know that, or you should know it. But in terms of contract law, it's a requirement of contracts. And if there's not a mutual exchange of obligations, and it doesn't have to be equal, and that's one of the things that's really interesting later on in the chapters, we go into this concept of, is it fundamentally fair if someone really gets what we think of as a hard bargain? One person really benefits in a really lucrative contract, and the other one seems to be kind of taken advantage of. The question is, will the law enforce it? Generally, the law does. We allow bargains. But something needs to be exchanged. So usually it's money for a product, right? Or money for services, common sense. But other times it's not. It's exchange of legal principles. So if my neighbor, for example, is going to paint his house a hideous orange, and I see him out there, and I see him starting a little bit, and maybe I have a very strong view of his house outside my office here, and I say to him, I says, you're going to really paint it that really bright orange? And he goes, yeah, I really love orange. And I'm like, I'm gonna offer you $1,000 to paint it a more subdued orange. Could that be a valid binding contract? Yeah, because both parties are legally changing their position, and it goes to the next element. So that's the third element is got to be consideration. The fourth element, it has to be for a legal purpose. It's kind of common sense. And what I mean here, it's not, obviously if I hire someone to kill my nemesis, that is not a valid contract because it's not for a legal purpose. It's illegal to hire someone to kill somebody else. It's illegal to I agree to buy so much meth from you next week for $1,500, and we put it in writing and have it notarized. That's not a contract. Why? Because it's not for a legal purpose. But careful, it's not always about criminality. A lot of people are surprised by this. Sometimes contracts are illegal, not because they're criminal and not because they're immoral. It's just because the law won't allow that to be effectuated for some policy decision. So, for example, if you have an agreement to sell my house and you're going to take 3% of the gross proceeds, but it turns out you're not a licensed realtor, that's actually an illegal contract because only licensed realtors can earn a commission for the sale of a house as a conduit to a sale. That surprises people. And sometimes there's some really odd contracts like out there that are just void under law. I pay my daughter to ask my daughter, your husband, I'm not so crazy about him. I'll give you $50,000 if you divorce him. And let's assume he is a real jerk. He's a real bad guy. It's really in my daughter's best interest to divorce him. That, by the way, is not the case. He's a great guy. Would that be a valid binding contract? So my daughter does divorce a guy. Can she collect $50,000? No. And the defense is it was for an illegal purpose. To pay somebody or to enter a contract to incite divorce is deemed illegal under the law. It's not about criminality. It's not about unethical, desires. But the government has a societal purpose in maintaining marriages and not allowing people to interfere with them unless by their own accord. So legal purpose, that's kind of a common sense one. And the fifth one's very, very interesting. And it has to be in a certain form. So you get these 5 elements. What do you mean certain form? Most of you probably entered this class thinking contracts have to be in writing. I certainly did when I first went to law school. I was, I have a valid contract if it's in writing. No, we contract all day, usually orally, sometimes without even spoken words. It's called an implied contract. So when I walk into a convenience store, no one buys newspapers anymore except me, I think. So I grab a newspaper, and I don't know what I'm going to grab. A bag of cashews and some circus peanuts, my favorite candy. I think I'm the person who likes circus peanuts. So I got these things, and I go up to the counter. I might not say anything to the clerk other than, boy, it's kind of a humid day for a cloudy day today, late September. And the clerk says, yeah, it is. And I exchange the money, and I leave up my package of goodies. Was there a valid contract entered in? Well, we're both competent, we're both of age, we're both, let's assume, not mentally limited in some fashion. It's for a legal purpose. There was an offer and acceptance, but not spoken, not even in writing. How did the offer and acceptance occur? It's implicit by me putting the goods up from the merchant onto the counter, handing over the money for the prices that were on the product. That is actually a valid contract. Was it an appropriate form? Somebody say, no, contracts have to be in writing. Most do not. And we'll get to that in chapter, I don't know if it's 9, 10, or 11. I think it's chapter 11, actually. We'll talk about some contracts do have to be in written form. Don't lose your common sense in this. We're going to make some contracts, because of something called the statute of frauds, be required to be under a written document in order to be enforceable. But most contracts don't. Most contracts can be spoken, and some can be implied. Like if I see my neighbor out, I think he mows his lawn every day. Just always seems to be a lawnmower, go back and he hires a professional team to do it. He's got quite a lawn. And what if and they look over and say the professional crew is mowing the lawn, and he's looking over at my hayfield, which isn't really a hayfield, it's just I don't mow my lawn very often. And he looks at my lawn and he kind of shrugs my shoulder like, hey, look at that. And I said, yeah. And I kind of nod and kind of give him the wave, come on over. Do we have a contract for him to mow my lawn? Somebody's going to say, well, no, because we didn't get enough information in the offer of acceptance, like how much is he going to charge me, how much am I going to pay, all those things. And how can you have a contract just by those actions? Actions speak louder than words, and that's where the phrase comes from, believe it or not. It's from contract law. That would probably be a binding agreement. How much would I have to pay him? A reasonable amount of money. He can't charge me an outrageous amount of money, even though that's what he usually charges. It has to be within the ballpark of reason. And people are going to be surprised by that as we go later in the chapters that we can have oral contracts, we can have implied contracts, but sometimes they do have to be in writing. Somebody, which ones you want to know right now? I'll just give you a quick acronym. I did not think of this. Another law professor at a law school thought of it, and I just thought it was really good. My legs is the acronym. Contracts in relation to marriage. prenuptial agreements, divorce settlements, things of that nature are required to be in writing. So marriage, my legs is the acronym, M is the first. The next one's Y. Contracts for more than a year by their nature have to be in writing to be enforceable. So you hire someone to work in your office for 2 years for $50,000 in the first year salary, second year $60,000. That would have to be in writing because by its very terms, it's more than a year. So the next in the acronym of my legs, contracts for purchase and sale of land or interest in land. The next one is an executor's promise. Someone's taking care of a decedent's estate, and they're going to promise to pay some bills or sell something or buy something on behalf of a decedent's estate. That contract has to be in writing to be enforceable. The next one that's very important for business law and for us as members of society, you need to know that goods over $500 to be enforceable needs to be in writing. So I go buy a snowblower for $1,100, or I agree to. I go in a snowblower shop. I said, I really love this $1,100 snowblower you have here. It's great because I'm going to buy it. I'll be back tomorrow. Do we have a binding agreement? We don't, because it has to be reduced to writing and signed by me before that contract can be enforceable against me, because it's a good, movable, objective, tangible thing. That's a good. And it's valued at more than $500. You have to be in writing. And the last one in my legs is S, and that stands for Surety Ship. Somebody promising to make good on a debt of another person. So my kid owes some money to somebody, and I want him to get an extension of credit somewhere else, and that's holding him up. If I call that creditor and say, hey, I'll make good on his debt, lend him some more money, in order for my promise to be enforceable, I would have to reduce it to writing and sign that promise in writing. But there are others. Those are the main ones under my legs. Those are the ones I want you to know for business law, which contracts have to be in writing. Otherwise, all the other contracts, they can be huge amounts of money. They'd be contracts in theory for billions of dollars. But if they don't meet one of those obligations, they can be oral, believe it or not. You wouldn't want them to be oral. And that's the other argument. Why any contract of importance should be reduced to writing, because when you reduce it to writing, what do? You think about the details a little bit better. You think about whose obligation is what happens if there's accidents or things, who's going to supply the products in relation to the services. All those kinds of questions tend to be thought out a little bit more in detail when you start reducing things to writing. It's a surprising phenomenon. So anything that's really significant to you, reduce it to writing. But don't be obnoxious when you go to buy a stick of gum and say, hey, I'm going to buy a pack of gum for $1.50 from you. Let's write up a written contract for the enforceability of this thing. That's nonsense. Imagine going to a grocery store and having all those groceries somehow written out in a contract. Some of you are going to say the receipt is the written contract. No, the receipt is evidence of your implied contract, because there's nothing about the terms in the contract, just the price of what you paid. That's all it is, a receipt. So anyways, that's kind of in a nutshell. We're going to expand and really talk about that as we go further later. But you need to know some of these definitional terms. You need to know what is a contract. We just talked about a legally binding agreement between two parties who are competent and meet all those other standards. But you should know what a void agreement is and what a voidable agreement is. Not being able to recognize them necessarily, but you should know what the terms mean. A void agreement means it's not good, it's not valid, and it can't be made good. Those are usually contracts for illegality. Those can never be good. You can't say, well, the contract's illegal right now, but we can somehow fix it in some way to make it legal. That's not, it's void. It's void. It was never good. It's a void contract. Voidable means it's a valid contract right now, but one or the other party, or both, might be able to rescind its obligation because of some issue like lack of capacity, or when we get into later, duress, fraud, or mutual mistake, undue influence. Things like that make the contract not void, but voidable, giving one or both of the parties the option to walk away or to continue going forward. It's sort of like it's on thin ice. So void, never good, never going to be good. Voidable is it's good right now, but one or both parties may have the right to exercise a rescission of it. Next one is express and implied. Express contracts are what we mostly want to see, right? Overt terms expressed by the offerer, overt words and spoken or written from the other side. That's express. The terms are overtly stated either in oral form or in written form. That's an express contract. An implied contract is implied by the behaviors of the parties. And I always give that example when I used to go into a certain Dunkin' Donuts in Rutland, Mass. When I first started them out, it must have been like 8 years in a row. At a very regular schedule, and I was always in there at like 7:10 every morning. And I am a creature of habit, and every morning I'd order exactly the same thing, a medium black coffee. And so after a while, when the workers saw me come in, the people working in the Dunkin' Donuts in this little convenience shop in Rutland, Mass., they would just have, they see me and they pour the coffee and I put my money down and I walk away. What happens if I walk in one morning and I just go use the restroom and I don't get the coffee? Did I breach a contract? I think there's an argument I did because of the long pattern of conduct was implicit that I was entering into a contract that next day, Monday through Friday, during the school year. I did that quite often. So when they saw me, the seeing of me entering the door was the implication I was going to ask for that cup of coffee. And we know them when they see them. These are the ones that are a lot of trials happen over, because when does an implied contract really occur? They're dangerous because you can say, I had an implied contract. He wanted me to paint his house. I was walking around with my paint truck and a guy waved at me. So the next day I stopped up and put up all kinds of staging and I started scraping down their house and I started painting. They were gone for 2 weeks. So I did a great job in their house, sent them a bill for $5,000 they have to pay. We had an implied contract. You can see how the homeowner says, whoa, you need something more than that kind of behavior for an implied contract. I was waving at you because you're my neighbor, And so it's a very, very difficult issue when one is in an implied contract to win or not. Most contracts are a mix between implied and express. So I might have a contract with you orally. I'm going to mark several trees on my property, 10 trees you've agreed to cut down. I'm going to mark those 10 with a orange ribbon. Those are the ones I want cut down. And then all of a sudden you cut them down and they're laying on the ground and they're not chopped up or anything like that. I might make an argument as a homeowner that it was implied that you weren't only going to knock them down, but that you were going to cut them up and remove them from my property. You might argue, no, that's not implied. That takes a lot more work and effort and money. And so there's arguments over some aspects of contracts are express. Usually some parts of a contract are implied because there's a lot of details that people expect to get done. And usually there's expectations in the industry of different fields that certain things will be implied. And there's often a debate about, again, what is implied and what's not. You usually can't, unless you're, like a very technical person and you have the time, unless it's a very, very important, expensive contract, you can't put down every devil in the detail. It just becomes very, very cumbersome to do so. So that's voidable, implied, and express. Formal and informal, we're only doing, or simple, I should say, formal contracts and simple contracts. We're only going to do simple contracts in this course. I hate the term simple because it sounds like they're going to be insignificant. A simple contract can be for billions of dollars. Simple means it doesn't mean one of the formal ones. Formal ones relate to things like commercial paper, like drawing checks from banks. The check is a type of formal contract. Recognizance are a promise to the court to do certain things. They do a lot of criminal work, so sometimes people are released on personal recognizance. A overt promise to behave in a certain way or do certain things while they're released from custody. There's things like debentures that a corporation can issue. Certain stock certificates might be considered a formal contract. We're not going to deal with them in Business Law 1. It's sometimes called commercial paper. If you guys go into law school, you might take a class called commercial paper or negotiable instruments. Those are the things we're talking about for formal contracts. We're not going to deal with them in this class. So every contract, if I give you a hypothetical, say, hey, give me a list of terms you can use to describe this contract, automatically you're going to say it's a simple contract. And the next one's important because certain kinds of rules might apply later on, whether it's executory or executed. And I hate legal terms because it throws people off. It scares them. All it means is executed, it's done. I performed, you performed. I painted your house, you paid me. Because once a contract is executed, certain rules will be different than if it's in its executory stage, meaning either one party hasn't performed or the other, or both. And most contracts have an executory portion. You hire me as your attorney to represent you in an operating in the influence case. You haven't paid me yet. I haven't done the job yet. But we have a valid contract because we sat down today and hashed out the terms of what I was going to do as an attorney and what you were going to do as a client, namely pay me. That's a valid contract. Legal purpose, we're both competent, but neither of us has done anything yet. So it's executory. Why do we care? Because later we're going to learn certain rules that maybe one or both of the parties might be able to get out of an executory contract, where executed contracts are much more limited in terms of undoing them, if you will, or being able to walk away from them because of some flaw or mistake or impossibility of performance, which we haven't gotten into, so don't panic, we'll get into it later. You just need to know the term and what it means. Executed, the contract's been completed. Executory, one party or both still have to perform. Then the next one, unilateral versus bilateral. Most contracts will be bilateral. Again, technical terms really scares the hell out of people. A bilateral contract is both parties are promising to do something. Most contracts are bilateral. A unilateral contract is one party is making a promise and another party simply accepts by performing. These are commonly like, I'm going to have a road race. I don't know why. I'm going to have some road race in my community, a 5K. The winner gets $1,000. Second place gets $500. Third place gets $250. And then everybody else gets a congratulations for participating. I don't know why I said that, but a friend of mine just ran a one. He was all happy because he had script and he was put it on Facebook that he participated. I don't know, I just find that funny. But the point is that's a unilateral contract. You don't go, the person doesn't come and goes, Jim, I accept. I'm going to win the race today. That would be a bilateral contract. That's not what we have. Unilateral is basically there's one promise hanging out in the wind. The other party accepts simply by performing. They do it. Lost dog, $50,000. Well, my dog, I'd give a $50,000 reward if I could afford to pay for it because I love my dog so much. But you've seen signs like that, right? Lost cat, lost dog, $50 or $500 reward. That you don't knock on the person's door and say, I accept your offer. I will go and perform. No, you perform. That's how you accept. Most contracts, again, are obviously bilateral. Some are unilateral. And so going through these terms, the book explains them, I think, very, very well. It's a short chapter with tons of stuff in here, but it gets expanded again later in a later chapter. I do want to leave you with this wild card. It should have its own chapter. It's called Quasi contract or Unjust Enrichment. Sometimes you never enter into an implied. Some people argue it's related to implied, but it's really not. If one party benefits another party, without an agreement, you don't have a contract. But should there be maybe something in law that helps the other party seek justice? And this is called unjust enrichment or quasi-contract. It's also called quantum meruit. That's a Latin term for it. The dog is whining here to get out because she hears noises outside the room. Just a second, Martha. In the best example I can think of, and it's happened in my own life, I go into an apartment, I'm renting it, I'm dirt poor at the time, I can't afford cable, but like everybody else, when you set up your TV, what do you do if you can't afford cable and you see that little wire prong thing to hook your cable to? You still do it, right? You still hook in there. And then lo and behold, what happens? I have every cable channel there is. I've got HBO, I've got all the pay-per-view. I'm all excited. Was there an agreement? No. You can argue there's an implicit agreement by accepting those services. I must be agreeing with the cable provider to pay their bill. But I didn't. I just put it in there hoping I would get better reception through my TV antenna because I thought maybe it'd be hooked up to the aerial. You guys don't even know what I'm talking about anymore. But back in the day, we had things called antennas up in the houses. Do I have to pay? I don't have to pay what the contract would be, but I have to pay for the reasonable value because I've received the service at the other party's expense. Same as if I had a gas heat in the house, I had gas stove and other things that worked off of natural gas. I never entered an agreement with the gas company. When I went there, I turned on the stove, it was working. I used the heat during the course of the winter. Should I pay that reasonable fee? Yeah, not the contract price, but the reasonable cost. It's unjust enrichment. Think about it. What if I heard out right now, I go outside my house and I see a paving company coming to pave my driveway, which it desperately needs. They made an accident. They went to the wrong address, but I see them coming in and I don't object to them. And I'm looking at them do the job. They do a great job. And all of a sudden they hand me the bill. I said, you're one town over, right address, just the wrong town. It's right down the road, same name of street. Do I have to pay something? Probably there because I received the benefit. I knew they were conferring a benefit on me, and I didn't object in a timely fashion. These kinds of cases come up quite a bit. In fact, if I can't argue there's a valid contract, I try to argue quantum meruit or unjust enrichment. The other party is getting a benefit from the other party. And the big test, though, the big element in this is justice really requires that they pay something to compensate the other party. So you can't go around as a schemer and start like washing people's windows or pressure washing their home and knock on a door and say, give me some money. Unjust enrichment. Corman's class taught me this. I can get some money out of you. No. It has to be a bona fide benefit done in good faith for the other party to have received it. And justice really requires that payment or some kind of exchange be given to the party that's provided the services or the goods to the other party. It's a tough one because sometimes people say, hey, I don't have the money for this and I shouldn't have to pay for it because I didn't ask for it and I didn't want it. And I shouldn't have done it. And so it's all dependent on the facts. It's very contextually based. This chapter is filled with good stuff. Read it slow. And if you come away with a sense that goes, I like all this stuff, but I really don't know what it means, you're okay. That's what chapter 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 are going to do. They're going to breathe life into these elements. So Please be comfortable asking questions, raising concerns. Otherwise, have a great day.